Bam! Thomas Westbrook here of Holy Kool-Aid. You're watching Atheist Edge. Congratulations to you guys on hitting 1 year of putting out steady, amazing content. If you guys are watching this, like, subscribe, share it around. Let's even get to 100,000 by year 2.
The only other option, I thought, would be to try to convince myself that I believed. Indeed, I might be able to work myself up into such a pitch of desire for the product on offer that I could, for a time, believe that I believed.
Yeah, this is more Pascal's wager territory, although I do think it was interesting that she doesn't quite come out and say it, but it sounds like she really wanted to find a way, even if she had to delude herself in order to find something with that would give her confidence. And she didn't wind up doing something like blatantly obvious like faking belief, but she did wound up in Christianity, which not to be the snarky atheist, but is that a little bit delusional?
Well, she's attacking Pascal's from a direction that I've never seen before. She's amping it up to 11. She even says, I'm working myself up into like this fever pitch to where I'm going to just get myself in this mental state to where I can maybe believe. So she knows, rightfully, that you can't choose to believe, but she wants to do everything she can possibly do to get herself in a right state of mind to where maybe she can come and believe later. And here's where I'm resisting the urge to... Now, when I started reading, I didn't even get through chapter 1 before I said, ooh, it's going to be hard for me to not pull the no true Scotsman fallacy. And this is where the crack in my dike finally broke. And I don't consider it a no true Scotsman fallacy because I think I can back up my claim that she never really was an atheist. Mm-hmm. I think she thinks she was an atheist, and at the time maybe she thought she was an atheist. At best, I think she was an apatheist. I don't think she really even thought about it that much. And that's even after talking to her fencing coach last night. Mm-hmm. And because he assures us that she had atheist friends, she read atheist books. Okay, that's great. That does help a little. That does lend some credibility. But the way she talks about herself and her thought processes, it's unlike any other atheist I know.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessary to go doubting her entire biography. I mean, I could certainly see a situation where a person could try and exaggerate their credentials a little bit, like I said, to try and bolster their testimony by making their low points seem even lower or more profound for Jesus to bring them to an even higher height coming out of them. But she doesn't really go into a ton of detail about her childhood or her upbringing or anything like that.
Detailed? She did at all. She doesn't bring it up at all, does she? I could be mistaken, but
yeah, I'm trying to remember and I can't think of anything, but yeah, I have more problems with the book that don't require. I'm willing to give her the benefit of the doubt that she was an atheist, and then we can go talk about.
Look at my notes, Chris. Things. It's funny you said that. Look at my notes. I said, well, I will give her the benefit of the doubt for now, which is exactly, see, our brains are linked. And I also say I have never ever heard an atheist say this in my entire life. My entire life, I've never heard an atheist say that they have this desire for God, and so I want to work myself up into this frenzy to where maybe I can believe in God. I've never encountered an atheist so far that willfully wanted to have faith.
Now, she does say at different points in her story that, like right here, she tried to work herself into a fever pitch and try and find a way to believe in God. But she also says, like, I never really felt like I needed to believe in God. And it's...
Well, which one is it?
Yeah,
things can change over time. I understand that, but...
Yeah, and those could be different points in her journey. Mm-hmm. But it's just kind of there's a couple weird contradictory statements in the book like that.
Yeah.
And they don't really help her cause much.
St. Paul's forthright declaration that Christianity is based on the historical witnessed events of Christ's death and resurrection.
Well, St. Paul said it. Why wouldn't you believe St. Paul? yeah. It's like you can only say that after you become a Christian. Paul talks in like 1 Corinthians 15. He mentions this old creed, which is what she's probably referring to here. But you know, there's a wide variety of reasons to believe that Jesus' resurrection is not historical, not witnessed because it didn't happen. There are a number of reasons to doubt the narrative, and just saying, well, this famous Christian said it happened, so I believe it, is not a sufficient reason in my book.
Okay, you and I both agree, and academic consensus is Paul existed as a human being, and he wrote at least 6 of the 13 epistles.
Right.
And that there is little to no doubt that happened. So we can't take him as a credible reference. But Paul himself admittedly never met Jesus face to face. He may or may not, in Galatians, he may or may not have met Jesus' brother. That's the closest he came. If we're talking about an actual witness of Christ's death and resurrection, Paul's not the guy.
But he totally saw the resurrected Christ on the road to Damascus, which was definitely not a hallucination or stroke or some other weird thing like that.
Yeah, but I everyone thinks I thought I saw I thought I ran over a guy once on a 23-hour long road trip from Quantico, Virginia to San Antonio, Texas. I was going through the Appalachian Mountains, and oh man, I should have pulled over. Had the radio blared. I was sticking my head out the window trying to stay awake. And there was this hillbilly he was the stereotypical, had the straw hat, the pitchfork, the overalls with no shirt on. And he was standing in the middle of the street and just smiling at me. And he wasn't getting out of the way. And then I hit him. But I didn't hear a thump, thump, thump. And I looked back. There was no one behind me. And he wasn't even there. And then about maybe 10, 20 minutes later, he was in my passenger seat. He turned and looked at me and smiled. And then I blinked my eyes, kind of rubbed my eyes, and he was gone. I was totally hallucinating.
Are you sure you didn't have an experience with our resurrected Lord Jesus Christ?
Come on. I mean, really. Everyone's got a story like that. How much weight do you put into it?
Blind faith.
What's the difference between faith, just regular faith, and blind faith? When a Christian, when Dr. Ordway says blind faith, does she mean just regular faith, or is it something different? No. Why is it that the same adjective is never used for other types of belief or knowledge? Like, for instance, you never hear blind reason or blind logic. Mm-hmm. You always hear it in conjunction with faith. Does that add to faith? Does it change its meaning?
Admittedly, I don't think anyone says with pride, I have blind faith. They think they have reasons for belief, but it really comes down to blind faith. So when I was working at a Christian bookstore back in the day, we had bumper stickers that said, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. That's blind faith. We didn't have any bumper stickers that said, I have blind faith, because no one would buy them. But they may phrase it in other ways that reveal their blind faith. And obviously there are other Christians who are more well-read, well thought out, and may have more intellectual reasons for believing that we can then talk about and debate, and are part of the reason why we can have shows like this, because they're interested in talking about those reasons. But even those Christians, I think, would have a little bit of disdain for the actual legit blind faith believers.
I wonder why she even brought up blind faith here. Maybe it's because just right before this, she talks about Paul, and Paul, right after the Damascus incident, was blinded for 3 days. Maybe it was something having to do with that. Because usually, yeah, you're right. When you hear blind faith, it's something pejorative. It's usually denigrating. So maybe she was referring to Paul's 3-day blindness.
Well, she's kind of using blind faith in kind of the same way that we just were, where she says she does not have to resort to blind faith because she has all these other good reasons, which she will get into later on in the book. Right.
Easier by far to read only books by atheists that told me what I wanted to hear. That I was smarter and more intellectually honest than the poor, deluded Christians.
Well, I mean, I'll give her credit because, yeah, it's easy to stay in your own echo chamber and read books that just say, "Oorah, we're the smartest and here's why." It's much more challenging to read books that disagree with you, whatever you believe. So I guess good for her for recognizing that staying within that atheism literature series is not necessarily the ideal way to go about things.
Yeah, because that's exactly what every atheist book I've ever read is. It's just simple self-aggrandizement and congratulatory smugness, right? I'm being facetious, but yeah. I mean, and here again, this is, I think, her only reference to atheist books that she might have read, and she never names one. She never gives any poignant, examples from anything she's read. It almost feels like, Chris, tell me if I'm wrong, when you read this book, it almost feels like she purposely avoided talking about her atheist influences in the past and her whether by book or personality, out of fear of possibly infecting her readers. Because like you said, how many atheists are reading this book? We're probably the only ones. This is a Christian audience that she's talking to. And she doesn't want to poison that. She doesn't want to. I feel like she's very careful not to even bring up any good, valid, or any atheist viewpoint whatsoever, because she doesn't want to plant any seeds of doubt in her readers.
Well, there's ways to boost your atheist cred without making it seem like something that you want to read. Like if she said, "Oh, I read Dawkins and Hitchens and was really into them," that's sufficient. She doesn't have to say, like,
she doesn't even do that, though.
She doesn't even do that, but it's one thing to say that. It's another thing to say, "I read Dawkins and I found him completely convincing. He was a wonderful writer, and I was so glad that I read him." Like that kind of effuse praise would certainly make
I don't know.
it more.
I think that wouldn't plant a seed of doubt in the readers. If they went to the trouble of buying her book, and they know that this is going to have the Hollywood ending at the end of the book anyway. I don't think it would do a tinker's cuss to change their viewpoints.
Well, I'm not talking about planting seeds necessarily here. I'm talking about like not wanting to make these atheist books seem like things that Christians should read and perhaps inadvertently convince someone. I'm not. That's the only reason I can think of why you wouldn't want to mention being familiar with these authors if you had actually read these authors. And like anything else, maybe she's trying to keep the narrative trim and tidy, which is fine. But
I had built myself a fortress of atheism, secure against any attack by irrational faith, and I lived in it alone.
Well, Holly, that was by your own choice. It is common knowledge that there exists hundreds of atheists and other secular groups to provide a sense of community. We're not living in a bubble. We're not, how did you say it? We're not living alone. And more, there might have been a time when that might have been the case. But, I mean, even American Atheist has been around, Madeline Murray O'Hare, we're talking decades and decades. Even before that, Bertrand Russell had a society. I mean, there's been... I don't know if you all know this, but atheism is much older than Christianity. There were Epicurean groups long before Jesus was even thought of.
Yeah, as long as there have been religions, there have been people not believing those religions. As far as Ordway is concerned, I could see a situation where she's probably introverted, bookish, maybe she's not terribly socially inclined, and it wasn't until she got involved with the fencing club that she found a group of people that accepted her. So I don't think that her atheism necessarily led to her feeling alone. She may just have been a loner for a while until she finally found people to hang out with in a group that accepted her for who she was.
I held that I was the product of blind chance, working over millions of years, a member of a species that happened to be more intelligent than other mammals, but was not unique.
Jeez, where do we start with that one?
Man!
The idea that humanity must be unique, like we have to be super special snowflakes in the natural world, or else who cares about humanity? She doesn't seem to have a good idea of how natural selection works. She's talking like, as an atheist, she believed natural selection like creationists understand natural selection. And she's an English professor trying to get into biology here. And it's one of the only places in the book that she does it. But she's definitely outside of her area of expertise when she tries to address
and that's
evolution.
Okay. She can be, but steel man it, don't straw man it. And if that's on purpose, bad on her, shame on her. But if that's just genuine ignorance, I would like to ask her, give me just your quick Cliff Notes version of evolution, or of natural selection, and see if she can repeat it back in a way that makes I don't expect her to speak from an area of expertise. But yeah, you're right. This is the totally creationist view of, we just have, you hear accident a lot. Accident or chance or
random
or mere, just happen to be the most intelligent. An elephant just happens to have a long trunk. What does that doesn't mean anything to me. We just happen to have, a 3.5 pound brain that's capable of understanding its own mortality. Okay, well, that's our survival advantage, because we're pretty squishy compared to the other omnivores and carnivores out there. And if we didn't have a big brain and able to use tools, we'd have been extinct a long time ago. I'm curious to know how Dr. Ordway would define natural selection at all, if she's even aware that blind chance is the most dishonest and erroneous way to define it. I'm sure she has at least some cursory understanding of the process, or the organisms. Organisms with favorable traits are more likely to reproduce. In doing so, they pass on these traits to the next generation. Over time, this process allows organisms to adapt to their environment. It's pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward.
One of the reasons I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the little-regarded genre of fantasy was that I wanted to avoid that kind of literary theory and stick to a more traditional, meaning-based interpretation of the books. Even though in doing so, I was contradicting the principles that undergirded my atheism. I treated art, music, and literature as if they had real meaning.
Yeah, you'll see this over and over again, where she has a look at the trees kind of faith, except for her, instead of trees, it is art, music, and literature. She seems to think that, not only does she claim to have been pointed towards God by C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, John Donne, even before she had considered Christianity, but she ultimately chooses a church based on the art on the walls and the stained glass windows. And she seems to have a question of how the beauty of the world. She talks about biking down by the ocean down in San Diego, and that's kind of the tipping point for her. Like, that's when she first really hits her that God may actually exist, just with a relatively mundane, but I could see where it'd be a very profound natural experience. But it's just one of those things that, she doesn't really provide a means to say this can only be God and you need God to appreciate these things. That's kind of how it worked for her.
Yeah, it's the look of the trees defense. And it reminds me, Francis Collins' story with the frozen waterfall.
Yeah,
it reminds me of that. And you know what? We might not, non-believers, we don't have the answers, but doesn't mean you have to insert your answer and it automatically by default becomes the answer.
Now, just putting this out there, because I'm not sure I have answered this either. Christians well, not all Christians, but a lot of Christians will say that beauty and the ability to appreciate it is a gift from God, and that evolution, natural selection cannot account for that. So do you think that there is a good naturalistic explanation for our our ability to see beauty in the world?
I saw a T-shirt one time. I think it was. It said technically there's only 4 things that you enjoy, and I can't remember the 4th one, but then it lists them: serotonin, dopamine, epinephrine, and something else. So technically, I mean, here I'm going to put my mechanistic materialist hat on, but really, when you boil it down, art, music, literature, poetry, anything that you enjoy, or a funny movie, laughing, the idea of love, really, you boil it down, you only love 4 things. There's only 4 things that make you feel any emotion whatsoever: dopamine, serotonin, epinephrine, maybe melatonin. I don't know. There's a 4th one, but yeah. That's the mechanistic materialist view of it. I have to be honest here. This is the point in the book, Chris, where I started getting infuriated, and I knew I was going to do a response video to this. This is about when it was happening. The tone of the book took a turn here. And to imply that atheists just wander aimlessly through their life without meaning or purpose, albeit self-authored purpose, it's to be intellectually dishonest to the highest degree, in my opinion.
One day, I caught myself thinking favorably about euthanasia for the severely handicapped. Although I backed away from the idea immediately, I felt queasy that I'd even taken it seriously for a moment. Imagine holding an idea in your head. Must have been awful.
I just noticed an interesting tendency of believers: their inability to evaluate a hypothetical situation or entertain any thought experiment, especially if that doesn't comport to their current ideology. So right now, I could entertain the idea of euthanasia for the severely handicapped. I could do it. I'm doing it right now.
Sure.
It does make me feel queasy, but I have the intellectual honesty to run that to its logical conclusion. And I'm not going to shy away from it just because it gives me some icky feelings. And I think this is, I've noticed this in my experience dealing with believers. Hypothetical situations like if there were no God and it was proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, which is what I ask every guest that comes on our show. I ask every non-believer or believer. I tailor it. I tailor the question though. If there was beyond a shadow of a doubt no God, how would it change your life? What would you do differently? When I ask non-believers that, they give me straight, and they're always different. The answers are always different, but they're always honest. And they run it to ground. They run it to its logical conclusion. A Christian, first off, none of them like that question. It just seems like they can't handle hypotheticals as well. They can't entertain them in their mind. They don't want to, I don't know.
It depends on the Christian. Some of them are more imaginative than others, and that's fine. What I found interesting is that I can't imagine that there are absolutely 0 Christians who would be in favor of a death with dignity law or something along those lines. The Christians that get the headlines are the ones who are trying to keep Terry Schiavo alive or stuff like that. It may be unique to American Christianity, but there's a principle that life is precious and valuable and given to us by God. But the implications of that are we need to keep people on life support that are never going to wake up from it, or we need to put this person in a wheelchair while they're drooling and they can't think or clean up their own.
What's the stats there, you think? What's the percentages there? I think more are the pro-life support than you think. I think that might be the norm among believers.
Yeah, I'm not going to quote stats like I know them, but like I said, I'm probably biased by more public incidents that maybe there are more Christians who keep their death with dignity beliefs to themselves and aren't vocal about it.
I wonder why. It's dishonest to not speak your mind in a way, right?
I'm sure that's one of those things that could cause issues and conflict in your church and among friends.
Why not cause some problem? What, are you trying to keep your pew seats filled? I've got a friend who's a pastor, and he's an old earth creationist. He believes in a very old earth, like Hugh Ross. And some of his congregation doesn't. Guess what he never talks about in his sermons? Why, though?
Yeah, I
What are
wish.
you afraid of?
Yeah, and then this is why we have so many different churches and splits and things like that happen, because you have all these relatively mundane, not exceptionally scriptural matters that for some reason people decide to argue about. And so they split up and they form their own congregation of people who agree on what color the curtain should be and stuff like that. And
That's a good point.
I believed that it was possible and desirable to be a good person. Never mind the question of where my standard of goodness came from.
Yeah, this is another moral argument one, and it's another one of those arguments that keeps coming up, and I can't imagine why it does a lot of the time. Like, this is another one that got Francis Collins. This is one of his big things. The idea that we're moral creatures and our morals have to come from somewhere. What's interesting is that, okay, we're moral creatures. We have this idea of morality, and therefore we must have an objective source, and we believe that this objective source is the Christian God Jehovah. Okay, that's cool. As Christians, what do you think about gay marriage? What do you think about alcohol use? What do you think about rock music? What do you think about women wearing outfits that show their shoulders? There are all kinds of moral questions that Christians disagree on. Some of them they have in common, and there's a lot to disagree on.
I see where you're going.
So if you want to put God as the objective source of morality, then he's not doing any better of a job than we could come up with morals ourselves, because you still have all kinds of disagreements as to what this objective source actually says is moral.
If it was a divine source and we all have an internal little version of it, you would think it'd be more accurate amongst each other, right?
Yeah, I can't think of the verse, but there's some verse in there that says God wrote his law on our hearts. And clearly he seems to be writing different laws on different people's hearts.
Based on region and culture and...
Yeah, maybe just to mess with us. I don't know.
Right.
But I feel like, this comes from the same conflict that if we want to put well-being and human flourishing as a source of our moral sense, you're going to have the same thing. You're probably going to come up with a lot of stuff in common, and you're probably going to come up with some stuff you still disagree on. But it's basically the same results with no extra God brought into the picture.
Yeah. I wrote a little note on this one, and when she said, never mind where my standard of goodness came from, then she believed it was possible to be a good person at the time she was an atheist. And I would love to ask her how she, at the time, defined goodness. If goodness in now, the Holly Ordway of now, if goodness can only be evaluated by your God, then by your definition, atheists are completely incapable of being good people, by your definition. But you have to note that an extremely disproportionately low number of non-believers are in prison, for instance. We're even depending on how you ask the question, we're between 4 and 23% of the population. Now, let's be really generous and just say there's only 4% atheists on the planet. But there's 0.8% atheists in prison. There's a lot of examples, but that's a really good one, that if morality is objective and if we're rejecting it, how can you explain the inversely disproportionate number of atheists in prison, for instance? I don't know.
Well, there's probably a couple mitigating factors in there. One is there are things you can do that are immoral, debatably, that are not illegal. It's not legal to go and have an affair. There's also things you can be put in prison for that are illegal but not necessarily immoral. We could probably get into the disproportionate number of people in
White collar.
White collar, probably depending on what it is. I'm thinking like marijuana possession or some relatively mundane thing like that. And you also have people, I'm sure, who convert to Christianity while in prison. And
Yep.
I haven't seen that statistic, so I'm not sure.
Which goes back to that low point. Yeah, it goes back to that low point in your life. You know, that's a very low point in your life, and what are you going to do? You had a tendency to find your last best friend.
Or hey, if you're in prison, you're about to be up for parole. How better to make yourself look than to say, I've become a good Christian member of the community.
Atheist Edge.
Oh yeah, that's all atheists write about is how much smarter we are than everybody else. That's all we do. It's a big circle jerk of self-gratification. All right.
Walking the edge of what some consider offensive.
I had built myself a fortress of atheism. What the fuck is a fortress of atheism? Oh shit. Sorry. God damn it. Okay.
But your feelings don't matter here. Only facts.
His foresight declared that it was based on the historical. Oh my god. Yeah, okay, alright. Welcome to Paul's life. This is Paul's life. I just sent him audio files that are a nightmare. Okay.
Edgy commentary on the dangers of doctrine, the foibles of faith.
I'm so sorry. I'm a nightmare. Okay.
The bullshit of belief, the stupidity of superstition, and the idiocy of indoctrination.
Indeed, I might be able to work myself up into such a pitch of desire for the product on offer that I could for a time believe that I'm... Oh, this woman. Okay.
With razor-sharp wit, curiosity, and critical thought, we take an unblinking look at today's religions. We are Atheist Edge.